Hi, I'm back here again in SwiftPOS Touch, and in this video I'm going to be talking about receipt printers and receipt messages. Now I don't actually have a receipt printer connected to my computer, but I do have a file printer which I'll use to demonstrate how the receipts look. And it's a good approximation of how the receipt would look in real life with a few minor differences. Now you should already have a receipt button, or maybe it'll be called print table bill button somewhere on your keyboard, which you can use to manually request a receipt. There's also a button at the top of the screen which currently says receipt is off. If I tap that, that button will turn green and receipt is now on. That means that a receipt will print every time I finalize a transaction, regardless of the additional settings that are set up in these media keys. So if you do want a receipt every time, make sure that guy is enabled. If you don't, then go ahead and turn it off. If you want to adjust how your receipts look, for example the header and the footer and the kinds of information that are included on them, then you can adjust that wherever that happens to be set up. Now there are two ways it can be set up, either here at the terminal in Tools, Terminal Settings, Peripheral List, and then your receipt printer. If you edit that, you should see all of the information relevant to that particular printer. All of these settings and all of the customer details and all of the receipt messages are unique to this particular terminal. However, there is another way that you can set a receipt peripheral up so that you only need to do it once and then synchronize it across all of the terminals so they all print identical receipts. And here, if I click on this drop down, you'll see that I have a receipt printer already configured in Back Office. If I select that printer, then all of these options will be disabled, or at least they won't be changeable from here, and they are configured in SwiftPOS Back Office. This is the method that I typically like to use because it means you only need to set that peripheral up once in Back Office and then synchronize it across all of your terminals. The alternative is that you might have each receipt printer set up on the terminal itself, but then if you need to make a change to it, say for example add an ABN or change one of the variables or change the description, then you need to make that change on each terminal individually rather than just making that change once in SwiftPOS Back Office. Whichever method you go with, you can change the same information, the same settings. So that's all of these different settings down here, which you might like to enable or disable. They're all pretty self-explanatory. And the receipt messages will have the header, the footer, and languages. I won't really get into languages in this video, but I'll probably cover this in the next video. So we're most interested in the header and the footer. Now for the remainder of this video, I'm going to be working on the assumption that we are synchronizing the printer with Back Office. But if that is not the case, then most of what I show you will be still applicable if you're making those changes here at the terminal itself. So I'll set that as synchronize with Back Office, and I'll select OK and OK. And now I'll switch to SwiftPOS Back Office, where we can have a look at how those printers are configured. Here in the Connect Touch settings menu, there's an option that says Peripherals. And you can see in this screen all of the different peripherals that I have set up. I in fact only have one, which is just that receipt printer, but I'll go ahead and add a few more as we work through this. So if I highlight this entry here in the grid and click on Edit, you'll see that the screen that pops up is very similar to what we saw in SwiftPOS Touch. Now for the duration of this video, I'll be using what's called graphical printing as opposed to text-based printing. This basically just means that you have more control over all of the different text and variables and images that you might want to print on your receipt. Now if I disable graphical printing and take a look at the receipt messages, We can see that the header and footer contain simple text, which we can edit as we need. As well as various printer commands and variables. So for example, everything in curly brackets is either a command or a variable. You can either type those in directly if you know what they are, or if you're not quite sure, you can add them from one of the lists down the bottom here. We have variables here, and that's things like the name of the clerk that served the customer, dates, times, booking numbers, product information, things like that. And if we click on printer commands, you can choose various commands which will modify the text to some extent. So changing the alignment, changing the height and the width, turning color on and off if your printer has a color mode, and various other things to modify how the text appears on the receipt. That's all quite straightforward. I'm going to leave it there for non-graphical printing for now, and we'll take a look at graphical printing. So I'll re-enable graphical printing here, click on receipt messages, and you can see that this grid or this window is now completely different. We have our 3 tabs up the top for the header, footer and languages. We have a sample of approximately what will be displayed on our receipt header. Now most of this is mouse driven, so we can take, for example, the bottom of the header and drag that down if we need a little bit more white space, or if we want to add different variables and information here. Each of these little boxes that you see is an individual element or item, and you can move them around by grabbing the purple square over on the left hand side and just dragging and dropping them where they need to be. You can also change their height by dragging the bottom down or up. And once you have that particular item highlighted, the border will be red, meaning that that is selected, and you can change various attributes of the text inside it. So for example, you can increase the size of the text, decrease, and modify it with different alignments, add colors if you have that capacity, and you'll also be able to change the text of that particular element. So for example, we just have the variable in there. These curly brackets again denote that this is a variable of some sort, but if we want some leading text, we can also add that. And there's quite a lot of different types of variables that you might like to add. So for example, we have ABN down here, and that will be pulling the ABN from whatever is in the registration file of the software. Or if you just want to put the ABN in directly, you can remove the variable and just type in whatever you need to. If you want to add a plain text item, you can do that by clicking on Add Item, choosing any of these variables, doesn't matter what's there, and removing the variable. And then you can put whatever text you need to in there. Again, you can drag and drop those so that they're not overlapping. If we take a look at the footer tab, again we have a bunch of variables in here which you can add, modify or delete. Let's say we wanted to delete this guy. We've just selected it by clicking on it and click on delete item, and it is gone. Once you're happy with all of the changes that you've made, you can click on done. And as I kind of glossed over earlier, there are a few settings down the side here. Most of these you probably won't need to worry about. There's a few things here like show zero priced instructions, which you may or may not like to enable. That'll show things like if your customer has ordered a steak and they ordered it medium rare with pepper sauce, then ordinarily the receipt would print out just with the steak item and it would not show how the steak was cooked, but you might like to enable that if your customer wants to see that information for some reason. You may also like to show the PLU number. I'm not sure why, but you might like to do that. This item up here shows string PLU description. We covered string PLUs a little bit in a previous video. That's basically where you have a default name for an instruction, like for example, open food, and that will prompt the clerk to enter a custom instruction, which then goes to the kitchen. But for the most part, you'll probably leave these settings at default. So I'll press OK on that, and we're back here in the grid. And now we might like to create a different receipt printer. Say, for example, this receipt printer is for the bottle shop. We might like to create a different receipt printer for the bar. So I'll click on, actually I'll copy this existing one by clicking on copy, or you could just add a blank one if you wanted to. And we'll call this receipt printer bar. And you might like to modify something in particular about this type of docket, whether it's adding more custom information or more variables or whatever you might like to do. You can differentiate between the bar receipts and the bottle shop receipts. So I'll click OK on that, and I'll come back to SwiftPOS Touch for just a moment. Now if I come back into my Tools menu and Terminal Settings, take a look at Peripheral List in Receipt Printer, you can see that there are a couple of different receipt printers set up here. So I can choose that one or that one depending on where this terminal is located. Now if I print a receipt, now this is just a file printer, so it's not going to look exactly the same, but it's a pretty good approximation. Okay, so that's receipt printers in a nutshell, using graphical printing and also synchronizing from SwiftPOS Back Office. I hope that's been helpful for you. If there are any questions, go ahead and leave me a comment. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.